Good morning, delegates. I'm Ruthi Rajan, Deputy Editor of the Oath Legal Magazine. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Oath GC Talk webinar series is an initiative by the Oath Legal Magazine. Thank you for joining us for the session today, which has a focus on the travel and hospitality sector, in association with the law firm Charles Russell Speechlys and legal research partner LexisNexis. The topic, as you know, is a new direction of travel, time to re-examine the hotel management agreement, led by Simon Green and Reem Al-Mahrouz, who you can see on your screens right now. Before I introduce the speakers, I would like to give you a quick overview of our session this morning. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on the travel and hospitality sector. The majority of existing hotel agreements, usually in the form of HMAs in the Middle East, reflect a pre-pandemic world. The speakers will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on key provisions of pre-pandemic HMAs and the direction of travel for HMAs. Simon Green, one of our speakers, he is partner and head of Middle East real estate and hotels and hospitality for Charles Russell Speechlys. Having been in the region since 2008, Simon's main areas of expertise are large-scale mixed-use developments and infrastructure projects, particularly PPPs, city center redevelopments, real estate investment, management and finance, as well as hotels and hospitality. Reem Al-Mahrouz is a senior associate in the real estate and construction team in Bahrain. Reem advises on all aspects of commercial property, including development and urban regeneration projects, high-value investment acquisitions and disposals, hospitality, landlord and tenant matters, as well as associated management work in the Middle East. Simon and Reem will lead the session for the first half, and this will be followed by a short Q&A session. Some of you have sent in questions in advance. Please note that the speakers will cover a majority of the questions within their presentation. We will have a couple of polls that will be launched in between the session. Please share your responses when you receive a prompt on your screen. Please note that your responses will remain anonymous. There is also an option on the right side of your panel on both the laptop and the phone to type and send in your queries. As it is a session that is scheduled for 1 hour, we request you to send in queries that are relevant to our discussion today. Over to you, Simon and Reem.
Good, thank you, Ruthie, for that introduction. Good morning to everybody. We are delighted to support the Oath and the latest GC series of talks. So in terms of, as Ruthie mentioned, what we will be talking today about will be the new direction of travel for HMAs, and is it time to re-examine the hotel management agreement, or certainly certain parts of the hotel agreement. So as the slide indicates, what is the summary of our presentation? So we will discuss the following: the impact of COVID-19 on the hotel sector. We will give an overview of hotel management agreements and the contracting structures around hotel operations more generally, and we will effectively cover things that we've done in a previous talk 12 months ago for the Oath, but we will do that in a very kind of short form fashion, conscious that there is a lot of things to get through today. We will be talking for about 45 minutes perhaps in total. As I say, I don't want to kind of take up too much time in dealing with stuff that we've already dealt with 12 months ago, but the intention will be, I'm sure, for us to be able to circulate the slides and the notes from last year's talk, so as to provide people with any more interest in those two topics that I've just mentioned, and provide more detail on them. We will then move on to effectively the impact of COVID-19 on the key provisions of the HMA, so effectively the direction of travel for the HMA, and that's what I'll be handing over to Reem Al-Mahrouz, who will take that forward and deal with that section. And then finally, if there's time, which I hope there will be, I will talk about a few sector trends that we're seeing arising from COVID-19 and the current pandemic, and so that will be effectively the direction of travel for the sector. Good. So in terms of this slide, this is a brief kind of snapshot in terms of how the sector has been impacted by COVID-19. Arguably, the global tourism, travel, hotel sector has been the sector most impacted, most severely impacted by COVID-19. border closures, lockdowns, social distancing rules, health and safety concerns, all of those things have effectively fundamentally changed how hotels are operated and managed. We've highlighted some of these on the slide, but the key ones really are financial impacts. So you can see that there's going to be a global financial impact of between 50 and 60 billion US dollars, a very significant amount of money, and 10 to 15 billion of which is going to be impacted in terms of the regional GCC sector. Market variance, as you would expect, there are differences on a country-by-country basis in terms of what governments and authorities have been doing. Probably the most affected in the region is Bahrain, predominantly because it's so reliant upon Saudi Arabia in terms of tourism coming across the bridge. Conversely, Saudi Arabia, which is a relatively nascent part of the journey in terms of all things tourism, has probably been the most resilient, and somewhere in the middle is the UAE, which does have a very large hotel hospitality sector, but it also has been impacted due to its reliance on MICE, which is meetings, incentives, conferences and exhibitions. In terms of market recovery, Reem attended the AHIC conference a few weeks ago, and a number of the consultants and professional advisory speakers from that conference were indicating that they expect a recovery somewhere in between 2023 and 2025. Majority seem to agree that the Middle East will come into some form of recovery in 2023, which is obviously still several years away. So there is a significant impact, and it's a medium-term impact for the sector. And then finally, market trends, and we'll talk about this potentially also at the back end of the presentation. What we are seeing is certainly a shift towards what we would classify as EWA, so that's the kind of eco tourism, well-being, adventure tourism, agro-tourism, particularly with a focus on the health and the well-being taking centre stage. We've certainly been advising several clients in relation to new projects that focus specifically on wellness and health and well-being. So if we just move on to the next slide. Hotels can be managed and operated under various forms of contracting structures. The main ones are on the slide. So hotel management agreements is the main one. That's what I would classify as the traditional form of contracting. But there are others, and we would classify those as kind of alternative structures. So there are franchise agreements, franchise agreements, which effectively is somewhere in between. So you start off with a hotel management agreement and then you flip into a franchise agreement over a specified period of time or after a specified period of time. TPO, third-party operator agreements, which are also known as white label agreements. So you're not actually contracting with a brand, but you want a company to actually just manage the hotel for you. And then at the very end of that spectrum, just a straightforward lease, which is a very passive investment for an owner who then just leases its asset to an operator, to a management company, and they take on the responsibility effectively of nearly everything under that lease agreement. Alternative structures are certainly on the rise in the Middle East, particularly for owners that have the requisite resources, the expertise, the infrastructure to consider those alternatives. And there are some very clear advantages to those alternative structures. So, for example, there could be potentially more competitive fees, or certainly more profitable fees for both parties potentially, more control on the part of an owner. And as I've already mentioned, if an owner's objective is to actually have more of a passive investment, the lease type structure will certainly satisfy that. So there are a number of driving factors and benefits to considering the alternative structures. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail in terms of those alternative structures. They were the topic of the previous talk that we did for the oath. But if people want to know more about those, then we're very happy to share that information. The recent survey by HBS, which is what we've got on the slide, essentially found that in the Middle East, 84% of hotels are still being managed under what we would classify as that traditional management structure, which is extremely high, really. 11% being managed under a franchise agreement or through a combination of franchise and perhaps TPO, because they can be dealt with in unison. And then only 5%, a very small percentage, are leased. As I mentioned, we expect those those percentages to shift, and the alternative structures will continue to rise and potentially accelerate as a result of the current pandemic. We will touch on this later, but structures that allow for reduced operating terms, more flexibility, more control potentially, reduced fees, or changing the risk profile entirely are likely to be increasingly attractive as a consequence of COVID-19. For the time being, though, traditional contracting is clearly the main route. So we will focus today's talk in relation to the HMA. And if I then just, sorry, William, just next slide, please. If I then just kind of give you an overview in terms of the HMA, again, I'm not going to go into detail here. This was the topic of the presentation last year, and is in actual fact the topic all on its own. But HMAs are bespoke contracts. They are usually drafted by operators. They can be structured very differently, but they broadly have the same types of terms, and they are as shown on the slide. So appointment of the operator and the agency type relationship, obviously the management fees, the budgets, accounts, approval mechanisms in relation to expenses, and how things will be governed, capital expenditure requirements on potentially the owner in terms of repairs, capital improvements, how you deal with FF&E, so fixtures, furnishings and equipment, and then clearly termination events and consequences of termination. These are all kind of things that you would typically see as core provisions within an HMA. HMAs provide, in our view, a high degree of control to the operator, and that relationship, as I've mentioned, is one of an agency, and so therefore fundamentally an owner remains liable and responsible for the hotel. So that is a key point to note. And then finally, from my perspective, which I think is also relevant to some of the things that Reem will touch on, approximately 50% of HMAs in the region are governed by English and Wales law, and rather than local law. Now, it's not unusual, and the governing law is usually driven by operators, but it is important to note that HMAs don't have to be governed by local law, and therefore there is a very kind of key point to note in terms of the difference between common law and civil law in terms of certain key provisions in an HMA, the most obvious of which is going to be things around force majeure, for example, and Reem will touch upon that now. So I will hand over to Reem. I don't want to take up too much time in terms of the front end, because we will want to get on to the impact of COVID-19 on key provisions in an HMA. So I will now hand over to Reem.
Thanks, Simon. Over the next few slides, we intend to discuss how COVID-19 has had an impact on key provisions of the HMA, and we'll explore this in relation to hotels that are currently operational, hotels that are under development but haven't executed HMA, and the direction of travel for new HMAs. Before we start, we'd be grateful for your opinions in relation to our first poll question. And Ruthie, we'd be grateful if you could please start that for us.
Yes, sure, Reem. Delegates, you will receive a prompt on your screen in just a second for the first poll question. We will give you a few seconds to respond. We're still collecting responses, Simon and Reem. We'll just give them a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to be sharing the results of the poll just now. So please hold. Okay, so you can see the results on your screen. Reem, it's 9% have answered yes, 27% have answered no, and 64% not applicable.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think we'd be very interested to hear more about why haven't you been successful in this regard. So please do feel free to leave a comment later on.
Sure, I'll close the poll right now. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate that there has been a significant amount of commentary in relation to force majeure since the start of COVID-19. It's probably the most popular legal provision at the moment. And therefore, we don't intend to discuss force majeure in too much detail today. But a key point that we'd like to highlight is, as Simon mentioned, force majeure clause must be considered in the context of the HMA's jurisdiction, as there are differences between the way force majeure is treated under common law and civil law. As the majority of HMAs in the region, for example, are governed by English law, which is a common law jurisdiction, English law provides that the obligation to make payments will continue irrespective of whether or not a force majeure event exists. How has the impact of COVID-19 had on force majeure? Well, depending on the definition of force majeure or civil law, COVID-19 may constitute an event of force majeure. However, in relation to operational hotels, the ability to continue to apply force majeure for second or hopefully not third waves, new lockdowns or policies may be limited because these may be deemed as being foreseeable events. And usually parties will be under an obligation to mitigate the impact of force majeure. In relation to hotels under development, similar considerations to operational hotels will apply. However, force majeure may not be applicable to HMAs that include hard construction milestone dates. In terms of the direction of travel for force majeure in HMAs, well, we anticipate to see clearer definitions in HMAs, and these could include multiple COVID-19 waves or other travel-specific events. For example, one of our existing hotel management agreements includes disruption of flights as a specific event of force majeure. Parties may also look to extend force majeure to events that occur in a market in which they heavily rely on. And as Simon mentioned earlier, a good example of this could be Bahrain, which relies quite heavily on weekend travelers from Al Sharqiya and Saudi Arabia. We also anticipate to see more detailed and clear processes for agreeing force majeure as to whether or not it actually has occurred or not. And if the parties can't agree in relation to this, then an expedited dispute resolution mechanism would be put in place. Finally, and this is more of a benefit for owners, owners might try to negotiate the possibility where payments can actually be suspended due to force majeure. HMAs will usually require that the operation, repair, and maintenance of a hotel meets certain standards and requirements. These could include star rating, or for the majority of international brands, these would include their own brand standards. In addition, there is almost always an overriding obligation to comply with legal requirements. Brand standards and compliance is one of the main areas of discussion and negotiation between owners and operators. Operators will usually want strict compliance, particularly with their own brand standards, and owners will want a degree of flexibility. There are ways to achieve a bit of a balance, and those would include freeze periods, which would protect an owner against making additional capital expenditure for changes to the brand standards over a period of time. How has COVID-19 impacted standards and responsibilities? Well, in relation to operational hotels, owners may have been required to incur additional capital expenditure to meet changes to the operator's brand standards or policies or legal requirements, and we expect this to continue. These could include, for example, additional cleaning and sanitization requirements, or the use of more disposable materials. Owners and operators will need to consider whether compliance with local laws and requirements are enough, and if higher standards, so best international practice, should be applied, mainly in terms of ensuring, in terms of mitigating any liability to guests or employees. In relation to hotels under development, compliance with certain pre-opening conditions may be an issue if certain standards or requirements have changed, or, for example, if materials or supplies become unavailable. Depending on the stage of a hotel is at, parties may also want to consider changing designs in order to future-proof their hotel against upcoming trends, and Simon will discuss these in a bit more detail later. Where do we see the direction of travel? Well, we anticipate seeing more flexibility and collaboration to deal with events such as hotel closures or emergencies. Owners may seek to require that the brand standards are more localized to the hotel or the country in which they operate in. And also, owners may also want to reduce the initial terms into lower terms, as they may be less inclined to commit to long-term agreements given the uncertainty in the market. At the moment, and in the region, we usually see initial terms between 15 to 20 years. Well, the majority of HMAs in the Middle East include performance tests. Currently, a typical performance test would allow owners to terminate their HMA if the operator fails to meet two tests. One is a percentage linked to a RevPAR, which is the revenue per available room, and the other is a percentage against gross operating profit, GOP. We've set out the typical percentages we would expect to see on our slide. Performance tests won't usually kick in until a few years after operation has commenced, and an operator will normally be required to fail both of those tests over a defined period of time. So we would typically see 2 consecutive years, or 2 years within a 3-year term. In practice, it's actually very difficult for owners to enforce performance tests, and this has been a key topic of discussion recently. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 on performance tests, well, in relation to operational hotels, force majeure will usually exclude performance tests from applying. As mentioned earlier, the tests will apply over time, and therefore it may not be an immediate remedy that an owner would be able to rely on to terminate their HMA. We anticipate that the ongoing pandemic will likely mean that performance tests will be even more difficult to trigger. So, for example, in relation to the RevPAR test, this is relative, and it's likely that other hotels in the competitive set will be in the same boat as the hotel in question, and therefore it's unlikely that underperformance would have been achieved. In terms of the GOP test, budgets will take into account the impact of the sector going forward. So again, it would likely be more difficult to trigger this test as well. Where do we see the direction of travel for performance tests? Well, we think that this is going to be an area that may undergo significant change. We anticipate that owners will seek to negotiate more meaningful performance tests that are based on either single or separate tests. Alternatively, other metrics could be used, such as an assessment against net operating profit as opposed to gross operating profit. In exchange, however, we anticipate that operators will want to include more shields to protect them against the extent and application of force majeure, performance tests, and that would go beyond force majeure. So, for example, that could even extend to changes of law or changes or specific changes to the hotel sector. Operators will usually be entitled to 4 main fees. We've set these out on the slide. These include base fees, incentive fees, group services fees, and technical services fees. There isn't a one-size-fits-all, as the fees tend to be heavily negotiated, but we have set out the figures that we would usually expect to see in the market in the Middle East. We've seen fees evolve over the past 20 years, and there's now a greater alignment between risk and reward. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 on fees and payment in relation to operational hotels, force majeure may mean that an operator is not alleviated from payments. Some HMAs may include higher base fees and ancillary fees, which mean that an owner will potentially still be liable for a higher level of fees. On the other hand, some HMAs may include higher incentive fees, and these fees may not become due or may be lower given the circumstances. We understand that some operators are taking a more flexible approach in relation to deferring fees to assist with cash flows. Depending on the HMAs, and usually we only see these in less than 10% of HMAs, a fee may be payable by an owner in lieu of the right to be able to terminate the HMA early. This is also known as termination for convenience. The impact of lower management fees over the next few years due to market recovery and the pandemic may mean that a reduced termination fee would be payable. Strategically, owners may be more inclined to terminate their HMAs early. So I think it's one to watch this space. Usually, the fees for hotels under development are limited to technical services fees, and these are fixed payments and are triggered by milestones. So if those milestones aren't achieved, then clearly those payments will not become due. In terms of direction of travel, this is another area where we see a significant change. We anticipate to see further alignment in relation to risk and reward. This could mean even lower base fees that may also scale up over a period of time and then stabilize. We may also see higher incentive fees as well to encourage operators to manage hotels with commercial efficiency. The basis in which fees are calculated may also change. So, for example, the assessment of GOP may evolve to gross room revenue, where an operator isn't responsible for managing certain parts of the hotel, such as food and beverage outlets or spas. Also, the traditional definition of adjusted GOP, which is usually used to assess incentive fees, may also become a bit more enhanced to exclude certain items such as taxes or FF&E. Owners may want to hedge risk of an uncertain market and ask for a fixed payment or a return. So these could include or come in the form of an owner's priority, which would be a fixed slice of payment that would be paid before an operator receives their incentive fee, or an operator's payment or performance guarantee, which does what it says on the label. Alternatively, owners may impose a cap on the maximum amount of fees that would be due to an operator, and that would also protect them from reduced returns. We anticipate that owners will continue to push for more transparency in relation to group fees. We understand that this in itself is something that's often seen as not being as transparent. And they may ask for a percentage to specifically be allocated to their hotel or their market. We're currently trying to negotiate one of these, so we can let you know how that pans out. Operators may also be more encouraged to provide for key money, which we've been seeing less of over the past couple of years. And they may do so by either waiving technical services fees or directly making direct contributions. I anticipate that they might look to do this for strategic assets, such as landmark hotels, or hotels that are currently that suit current trends in the market, such as wellness. In relation to employees, most employees are usually employed by an owner, but almost always are exclusively managed by an operator. So an owner will usually have very limited control. Employee costs, including termination costs, will also usually be operating expenses. There's been a very visible impact on employees as a result of the global pandemic, and with owners and operators looking to maximize revenue and reduce expenses, we anticipate that this is going to be a topic that is ongoing. In terms of hotels, at each stage, employee contracts and HR policies should be carefully scrutinized and updated where possible or permitted. Depending on the jurisdiction, it may not be possible to exclude liability for health and safety, and therefore best practice in relation to these standards should be adopted. Going forward, we anticipate that we will see more enhanced employee liability provisions in HMAs, and employee contracts, as well as defined standards within the HMA with regards to health and safety. We also might see alternative employment strategies become more popular, more common, in order to minimize costs, and these would include relying on outsourced employees or zero contract employees, and where possible, consolidating owners, employees, or consolidating roles. In terms of insurance, sorry, I think there is a bit of an issue. Sorry, there seems to be a bit of a technical issue, so bear with me as I reload the slides.
Yeah, thanks, Reem. No problem. Reem, if it's not opening, I can hand it over to my colleague to manage it.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just, oh, it's come on now. Is it okay?
Yeah, it has. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Yeah, I can just put it on slideshow mode. Thanks.
Great. So where was I? I think I was just about to start speaking about insurance. So I will quickly flip through. And here we are. So both owners and operators are required to take out insurance policies. We've set out the main forms of insurance policies on our slide. Usually, insurance premiums will form part of operating expenses. Main exclusion would be property all risks insurance. In terms of the impact of insurance policies, in relation to hotels at all stages, it's likely that insurance premiums will increase over the coming years. We also anticipate that owners and operators will and should carefully consider their existing policies and future policies to identify any gaps. Additional policies, rather than the standard ones which we highlighted earlier, may also be required. And going forward, we anticipate seeing HMAs to include a clear allocation of risk and liability, and possibly some further insurance obligations. HMAs will usually include for various budgets and accounts. The typical ones are set out on our slide. Operators will want to have much more autonomy over the availability of funds. Owners, unsurprisingly, will want to have more control. A balance can usually be achieved to a certain extent by including certain clauses such as divergence clauses or freeze periods, which we spoke about earlier. In terms of impact, In relation to operational hotels, as a result of the global pandemic, owners may have been liable to inject additional funds, often at very short notice, to address changes required to comply with the legal requirements or changes in standards. Existing HMAs are unlikely to include the flexibility to reassess budgets after they've been approved, and therefore 2021 budgets and budgets going forward should be carefully considered. Close cooperation between owners and operators will be required in order to manage available funds. Again, like we mentioned earlier, we've seen certain operators taking a more flexible approach by agreeing to temporarily dip into available reserves, such as the FF&E reserve, in order to assist with cash flows. Clearly, these funds will need to be replenished over a period of time. The main budget that would be relevant to hotels under development is the pre-opening budget, and similar considerations in relation to operational hotels will apply. Finally, in terms of the direction of travel, we anticipate that owners will likely negotiate additional controls over allocating and controlling expenses. We also anticipate to see HMAs include provisions which would allow budgets to be reassessed if certain circumstances apply. And also, we've recently negotiated a specific termination right, which would permit an owner to terminate if the operator materially deviates from an approved budget. So some termination rights may also become more common. Owners and operators may want to agree emergency funds, which would cover expenses that may immediately be required short notice for certain events. Otherwise, HMAs could include express rights for reserve funds to be utilized for defined purposes, which again, it seems to reflect the current practice in relation to certain hotels at the moment. I'll hand over to Simon in a few minutes to talk through some sector trends. However, just before we start, we'd be great to see your opinions in relation to our second and final poll question. Ruthie, could you please pull up the poll?
Yes, Ree. Delegates, you have the poll on your screen right now. Please do share your responses immediately so that we can share the results. Please note that your responses will remain anonymous as well. We're still collecting responses, Reem. Just give it a few more seconds.
Thank you.
We're just running the poll for a few more seconds on your screen. If you haven't sent in your responses, please do answer. Thank you. We're still sending in the answers. Okay, I think I'll close the poll in just 5 more seconds. If you haven't answered yet, please do answer the poll. Thank you. Okay, I'll close the poll now and I'll just share the results. Just give me a minute. Okay, Reem, the results are 22% yes, 17% no, and then 61% have said NA.
Okay, also very interesting. And again, we'd love to hear more about that.
So I'll just hide the results for now and you can go ahead.
Good. So over to me, I think, for the last couple of slides. So sector trends and direction of travel. So, will the impact of COVID-19 on the sector lead to a raft of new negotiations of existing HMAs? Well, the poll has been very interesting in that regard. Circa 20% have indicated that it has led to some degree of renegotiation, which actually is slightly higher than I thought it was going to be, which is perhaps a good sign, and showing that there is that relationship, that mutually beneficial kind of outcome point that we've already made earlier on in the slide is happening. But is it going to lead to a raft of new negotiations? I think fundamentally not necessarily. As we've heard, the current form of HMA is unlikely to give the parties, especially an owner, the ability to do that very easily. We've already heard about potential limitations around force majeure. Again, very interesting in terms of the poll indicating that only 9% of parties effectively have been able to successfully invoke force majeure. So that's not a particularly easy thing to do, given restrictions in terms of definitions and other kind of issues, particularly if contracts are governed by English law and it doesn't obviate the need to make payments, etc., etc. So it's not as easy as you necessarily think it may be to invoke force majeure. Ditto in terms of the performance test. Some owners have thought that the performance test was going to be their panacea to issues arising from COVID-19, and as we've heard, far from it. The threshold test is quite high, very high, and therefore that's not going to be the silver bullet. Not to say that renegotiation of terms won't be possible, and indeed we are supporting our clients in this regard. But as I've just mentioned, what's really important to try and achieve is this mutually beneficial outcome, and that's going to be unique to the circumstances of each party and the relevant transaction, essentially. What we may also see is an increase in kind of distressed asset transactions, so purchasing or disposal of hotel assets in a distressed environment. That's going to be of particular interest, I think, to funds, regional international funds that have effectively a war chest and can move quite quickly in terms of those types of transactions. Perhaps rather perversely, we are very busy in terms of our hotels hospitality practice. In fact, we've never been busier, and that's in relation to advising clients both in terms of renegotiations or certainly providing contractual analysis options where we may be in a kind of pre-dispute environment, but interestingly and perhaps quite surprisingly, we're also involved in quite a few new projects, brand new projects. Such projects usually have quite a long lead-in time, I suppose, with construction programs, in the 2 to 3 year period, particularly with the design element at the beginning. If it's a brand new hotel, that pushes the target opening date into 2023. So that's kind of timing nicely and coinciding nicely with the recovery that Reem has mentioned earlier. And we are also specifically seeing some of our clients really looking at projects now in that EWA space, so the eco, well-being, adventure, agro, tourism sectors, particularly for us in terms of health and well-being. That's certainly an area of focus for some of our clients. Fundamental message for me effectively is that HMAs are set to evolve from their traditional form. It won't be radical, but it will reflect the fact that owners now probably have a stronger bargaining position as a consequence of the pandemic. As Reem has mentioned, we are seeing this in areas such as perhaps friendlier performance tests or changes to the assessment of certain fees, or caps on fees, for example, with the end result being that you are seeing a reduction in the aggregate of those total fees payable to operators. In addition, we will see a continued move towards alignment of risk and reward. That's going to be a continued focus. The days of the operator, I think, taking a large base fee, which essentially is payable come what may, and not having that degree of risk share, skin in the game, whatever you want to call it, is probably over, certainly for the majority of operators, I think. What's also clear is that expert industry advice is going to be required, whether that's financial, legal, or otherwise, particularly from an owner's perspective, to ensure that those mutually beneficial outcomes I've just referred to are achievable, and the latest trends, developments are being taken into account when you're looking at those renegotiations or those new projects, as I've mentioned. Next slide, Reem. Great. So unfortunately, I don't have a huge amount of time left, conscious that we're probably eating into our, or just slightly overrunning on our time. But a number of these points have also been dealt with in our previous oath presentation. But what I did want to make a specific mention of is those points which we haven't already touched upon, and which are, which effectively are of a direct consequence of COVID-19. So, for example, rethinking of hotel designs, including retrofitting of existing ones. So OBMI, a hotel resort architectural firm and design firm, recently discussed some trends at the AHIC conference that we attended, and they are anticipating a move away from the traditional kind of hotel room focus of the bed to other things like maximizing living and well-being space. So, for example, having an inbuilt gym in your room, or giving you more working space if you're effectively kind of wanting to undertake some work, and not just kind of putting you into a corner, a very small desk in the corner. We're going to be seeing an increase, I think, in the use of technology, as you would expect. So, increased use of virtual check-in platforms, e-concierges, those types of things. Certainly, less focus on actually having to interact with, dare I say it, other humans. That's going to be, I think, an increased direction of travel as we see it. And then perhaps lastly, the mixed-use developments point is, it's effectively as a direct consequence of wanting to hedge risk. What we are seeing is clients wanting to make sure that their hotels are connected into other uses and they aren't just standalone assets. So that could be connecting into offices, shopping malls, etc., whereby those other uses are potentially providing a ready-made footfall for the hotel. COVID-19 has had an impact, a negative impact, on some of the other trends that we highlighted 12 months ago. So for example, 2020 was going to be the year, for me anyway, I thought, of the kind of the upscale 4-star business traveller type hotel. And certainly we were seeing a significant uptick in that at the end of last year. But I think it's hard to see the development of new hotels in that space whose raison d'etre is effectively the business traveller over the next few years. So I suspect quite a few of those will be put on ice. I'm conscious that we need to wrap things up there. Hope you found that presentation of interest, and we would be delighted to move on to some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon and Reem, for sharing your insight with us this morning. We do have a couple of questions that I'd like to read out. The first one is, has the impact of COVID-19 been felt more by the operators or owners? Will this mean future HMAs are more favorable to owners?
Perhaps I take that one. I think it depends from my perspective, and as you're probably expecting to say that, it's a question of what does that alignment of risk and reward look like. Obviously, if the operators I mentioned are sitting there with a very healthy base fee, and that's payable come what may, then you could argue that the operator isn't doing too badly out of this current pandemic. As we mentioned, though, I think the direction of travel has been a greater alignment between risk and reward over the last 10 years or so, and so therefore it is likely that both parties are going to be affected with reduced revenue, reduced fees payable to the operator, and obviously increased costs associated with compliance with local laws and requirements from the owner's perspective. So I think it's probably fair to say, on balance, certainly both parties will have suffered. In terms of who's going to benefit the most, I think the talk has probably identified that the direction of travel for HMAs is probably going to be more beneficial from an owner's perspective. We are seeing more bargaining power being shifted to owner. We are seeing potentially kind of reduced costs, or certainly a reassessment of those costs. One of the interesting things that we mentioned was, those kind of ancillary fees, which can actually add up to a huge amount. So in addition to base fee and incentive fee, you've got these system fees, or these global ancillary fees that operators do charge when it comes to things like their frequent guest program or what have you, and marketing programs. Obviously, there is certainly a push for a reduced percentage in terms of global programs, and an increased percentage in terms of local programs, because that's where owners are thinking that the majority of their clients and guests are going to come from, particularly when you've got restrictions on travel. So yeah, broadly speaking, I think the message from us is that we think it's going to be, in terms of direction and the evolution of HMAs, is broadly going to be more beneficial to an owner than an operator. But again, we have to work in an environment where it's a mutually beneficial outcome. But that's our view.
Thank you, Simon. We have an interesting one next. Force majeure or emergency situation. How did regional governments define the pandemic, and how does it affect the HMA provisions?
Interesting. Should I take this one, Sai? This is actually a really interesting question. I'll deal with the second part first. Regional governments, to the best of our knowledge, haven't actually declared force majeure. It's unlikely that they would as well. I think the exception to this has been Qatar, where I think only one specific government entity declared force majeure. So I think this goes back to some of the points that we discussed earlier, which relate to ensuring that force majeure provisions in HMAs include very clear definitions, specific circumstances, but also a clearer process in relation to agreeing what force majeure constitutes. It's been really interesting seeing the results from the poll as well, and potentially and clearly that shows that, like Simon also mentioned, that there's a very it's not as easy as simply pressing pause. So I think we'll continue to see force majeure evolve in HMAs in that sense.
Thank you, Reem. Okay, so next one's, I guess, on all of our minds. By when do you think the new normal in hospitality will happen, and what does this look like going forward?
Well, I think we can all agree that maybe the new normal has already started. Mm-hmm. So we can see quite a lot of hotels making a lot of changes to the way that they operate, and these might continue. So, for example, in relation to cleaning standards, or the protection of the health and safety of guests. Simon mentioned the use of technology, and these are definitely these may constitute the new normal in terms of hotel operation. I think an overriding, we think again in terms of linking back to what Simon said earlier, different financial consultants estimate recovery different times of the year. I think that's also largely dependent on the market. In the Middle East, we also think it's likely to occur in 2023. But one interesting sentiment from AHIC was actually that both operators and owners seem quite positive irrespective of the global pandemic, and quite confident that the market is going to bounce back in the medium term.
Yeah, listen, from my perspective, I would certainly echo that last sentiment. As I've mentioned in the presentation, we are busier than we've ever been, and it's not just doom and gloom stuff around, let's say, kind of litigation advice or seeking to renegotiate terms. It's in relation to new projects as well. We've got about 3 or 4 on the go, particularly as I mentioned, the wellbeing wellness space. But I think it's a demonstration that whilst the sector has been severely impacted, it's not game over for the sector, far from it. It's just going to evolve into different areas of focus, and it will adapt, and that's the key message, is adaptability. So that's our personal experience, and it's not as I say doom and gloom. In fact, actually in many ways it's quite positive.
Thank you, Simon and Reem. I'm conscious of the time and for our delegates. So I know that there were a few questions that we received earlier that dealt with franchises and non-branded hotels and other alternative structures, like you mentioned, Simon. So in the session last year with the Oath, Simon did discuss these topics in detail. So if you would like to know more about it, we would definitely connect you with Simon or forward you some of the content that we have on it as well. And for the rest, if we've missed out any questions, we'll definitely we'll connect you with Simon and Reem, or try to get responses for your questions, if that's all right. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. With that, we've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you, Simon and Reem, for offering your insight on this crucial topic. Our sincere thanks to the firm, Charles Russell Speechlys, for leading the discussion. Hoda and Emma at the firm, thank you for your help in organizing this session. We would also like to thank our legal research partner, LexisNexis, and also to my colleagues and niche publishers, Sunil and Sandhya, for their support. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Oath magazine's website. Thank you for joining us this morning. We wish you good health. Have a great week. Thank you, Reem and Simon.
Thank you
So much.